Hi, I'm Natalie Emmanuel. In this episode, we look at a woman who led the world's largest democracy in a war to stop a humanitarian crisis. Indira Gandhi, the daughter of India's first Prime Minister, followed in the footsteps of her father when war broke out on two borders of her nation. Navigating Cold War politics and the realities of modern warfare, she launched a war to stop the slaughter of Bengali people of what was then called East Pakistan. With wisdom, determination, diplomacy, and a team of military professionals, she pulled off an incredible victory and established India as a force to be reckoned with in southern Asia. Here to tell the story of a war queen who was not a queen are the daughter-father history team of Emily and John Jordan.
Natalie, it's so great to see you back in Atlanta again.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Emily. One thing I love about War Queens is that it showcases different kinds of women, not just women of different races or cultures, but women of different personality types.
Yeah, that's really true. We looked at women who were hotheads, women who were kind of cold and calculating. Some of them were night owls, some were early risers.
Natalie, speaking of night owls and early risers, now you've got a busy schedule with filming and rehearsing, voiceovers, interviews, and stuff like that. Do you have a routine you like to use that keeps you energized and healthy when you're traveling and on a busy schedule?
Well, the word routine is somewhat impossible with my lifestyle because it's constantly changing and things change very last minute. So it's very hard to plan anything. But for me, the key is the one thing I need more than anything is sleep. So I have to prioritize it. Second thing, if I'm not fueling my body properly, there's no way I'm getting through my life, my job and my constant changing schedule. I have to think very consciously about how I fuel my body. And, and this is the part that's the hardest is when it comes to sort of exercise and taking care of my physical well-being, it's very hard to squeeze that in. And I often just travel with a yoga mat and I try and just have a little stretch or, do a little something. I'm not always dedicated as I should be, but that's the kind of my way of getting around the crazy.
Well, the leader we're going to talk about today was someone who would wake up at 5 o'clock every morning, and like you, she did yoga.
Oh my God, I need that discipline.
Yeah, well, she didn't have to travel as much either. She was mostly a vegetarian. And she understood that leadership was a marathon and not a sprint. So she took care of her body and mind to enable her to work these long hours.
Are you saying that I could lead a country? Is that what you're saying, John?
I think you absolutely could.
Okay, good. Well, that's good to know.
Next phase of the career. There are actors.
World leader.
There are a lot who have done that before.
You have to host a TV show first, I think, and then you can do that.
So Indira Gandhi grew up in a British colony and would go on to lead the world's largest democracy into war. She pulled off a remarkable victory and would be compared to the Hindu war goddess Durga.
Democratic governments would pose a different set of challenges to leaders, don't they, Dad?
They sure do. There aren't a lot of men or women who are trained in leadership from an early age in a democracy. Now, we have a few political dynasties in America, like maybe the Bushes or the Clintons, but for the most part, for our government, leaders are drawn from the ranks of amateurs, and sometimes they have to learn things on the fly.
It's interesting because Indira kind of gets groomed into the political field. Did you ever have that feeling where you wanted your children to kind of go into your field of being a lawyer?
I think probably most parents would be flattered if some of their children followed in their footsteps. But I think a lot of parents also, they know the struggle that they've been through with their jobs. And sometimes they want a better job or a less of a struggle for their children.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever met a lawyer who's like, you should be a lawyer. It's so much fun.
Sure. In your case, you became a nurse in a behavioral health unit. Your younger brother wants to go into diplomacy, and he'll be studying in Germany. Older sister became an athletic trainer, and your mom and I were fine with all of those choices. Mm-hmm. But we weren't part of an impassioned activist type family that were true believers in what we were doing. And maybe it would have been a little different had we been that way.
So tell us about Indira and her upbringing.
Well, Indira Gandhi was almost born to go into politics. Her father was Jawaharlal Nehru. He was a political activist from Kashmir in northern India, back at a time when India was a British colony. Her parents were socialists, activists, and in and out of British jails a lot of the time that young Indira was growing up. Nehru, Indira's father, was a political ally and friend of the famous Mahatma Gandhi, the great Indian leader who influenced Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence and peace. But it came with a price. Indira had a tough life growing up. She lived alone a lot of the times.
And I really think that living alone created this sense of self-reliance, of independence for her. Like you said, it could definitely be lonely, but when you have all this time alone, mom's at work, dad's in jail, whatever it is, it kind of leads you to become independent and a strong leader.
Yes, but the flip side of it is that it left Indira with a very lonely and emotionally scarred upbringing. Her mother died when she was 18. She moved over to England to study at Oxford's Somerville College for Women. Indira was an excellent student in economics, political science, and history. She was terrible at Latin, and she almost flunked out of school, almost didn't get into school, because she just couldn't conjugate her Latin terms. Your younger brother would have been able to ace that part.
Oh, for sure. He's incredible at Latin. He actually speaks several other languages as well.
Yeah, but Indira, thank you for that plug. But Indira was not.
He paid me to say that.
Yet at Oxford, Indira met her future husband. He was a journalist named Feroz Gandhi, and that Gandhi was spelled with a Y at the end, not with an I like Gandhi. But Feroz Gandhi, the journalist, was really enamored with Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence and anti-British activism and changed his name so that he spelled it just like Gandhi with an I on the end. And that was a name coincidence that when Indira married him, would give her the same last name as the great Mahatma Gandhi, Bapu, but also she would be known as the daughter of Nehru. So she was combining these two great figures in India's independence movement into one person. And that gave her a huge political advantage, especially for a lot of voters who thought she might have been related to Gandhi.
Absolutely. The optics on it are incredible. And what's so amazing is Mahatma Gandhi and her father Nehru worked together as this dyad of one leads the spiritual movement, one leads the political movement. So like you said, she kind of coalesces those two sides into someone people can really follow.
But the question was, whom would they follow and where would they go after independence? So in 1947, 2 years after the end of the Second World War, India became independent from the British Empire. But like basically everything else having to do with India, it was a complicated story, and this breakup was no different. India was comprised of a lot of different religions, somewhere like, I think it's 1,300 different linguistic dialects. But the main religions in India were Muslim and Hindu religions. There were a small number of, I guess, Christians, Buddhists, and Sikhs. But Hindu and Muslim were the two that the British knew the most about. Well, they wanted to divide the country up. They did not want to have a lot of Muslims and a lot of Hindus living together because they were afraid of sectarian violence. So they sent over a lawyer who had never been to Asia, never been east of Paris before, to redraw the map of India. And basically they just sliced India up like meat on a bull, and they said this area is going to be Hindu, this area is going to be Muslim. Well, what could possibly go wrong with that, huh?
Essentially everything. You can't just call it halves and say it works.
Exactly. So what the British did was take the far eastern side of India, which was mostly Muslim, and call it East Pakistan. And the far western side of India, which was mostly Muslim, up in the Punjabi region, and call it West Pakistan.
So they made an India sandwich.
Basically, it was an India sandwich. The Hindus were in the middle. You had West Pakistan and East Pakistan, part of the same country that was 1,300 miles apart. There were as you can imagine, a lot of problems with this. Somewhere like 12 million people crossed over lines to get from the Hindu side to the Muslim side or the other side.
And anytime there's a great exodus like that, it's accompanied by so much violence, so many riots of people just trying to figure out where home is.
Yeah, there were somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people killed in the violence between Hindu and Muslim, and it was an absolute mess. But the British managed to screw it up even worse, if that's imaginable, because not all Muslims are alike. You can't just put a label on a person based on their religion and assume that they act like every other person of that religion. The East Pakistanis were very different from their counterparts in West Pakistan, even though they shared the same religion. The East Pakistanis were ethnic Bengalis. They were shorter, they were darker skinned, they spoke Bengali as their primary language. Meanwhile, in West Pakistan, those Pakistanis tended to be taller, lighter skinned. They spoke Urdu or Punjabi. So you're dealing with two very different ethnic groups that the British could not see the differences with, but they combined them into the same country. Author Salman Rushdie once wrote that Pakistan, East and West, was like two wings without a body, sundered by the landmass of its greatest foe, joined by nothing but God. Well, that was a pretty accurate description.
Absolutely.
And West Pakistan, unfortunately, began treating East Pakistan like it's a colony, kind of like the way, well, worse than the way your oldest sister treated baby brother when you guys were growing up. The West Pakistanis had all the government jobs. They had all the military jobs. They were siphoning money out of East Pakistan, which is a very poor area, and they basically abused their countrymen. Well, meanwhile, over in India, in the Hindu side, New Delhi's the capital, and Indira's father became India's first prime minister. Well, Nehru was a pacifist, and he was a member of the non-aligned movement.
It's difficult to be a pacifist in this time, though, because you have all these diverse groups of people struggling.
Yeah, you have diverse people struggling, and you're also caught in this new thing called the Cold War. You got the Soviet bloc on one side, you got the Western bloc on the other side, and you're trying to steer a non-aligned path, and that was very difficult. Well, during the time from 1947 to 1964 that Nehru is India's prime minister, Indira served her father as his hostess, his personal assistant, kind of his political scout. She was sort of the nice, pleasant side of Nehru. And by the mid-1960s, when her father died and her husband died, she was able to move up in the government to become the Minister of Information. And she actually had a government job in a government that was traditionally male-oriented.
That's something great to note as well, just that Indira was able to move up of her own hard work, of her own, obviously with some nepotism, probably. But she was able to gain the trust of people and earn her place.
Sure, she was working her way up the political ladder. And this is the time, that we're talking the mid to late 1960s, when we see her political personality start to come out. Here's some things about Indira that we learn from watching her work through government in the mid-1960s. First of all, she was cold and calculating. You didn't get a whole lot of warm fuzzies from Indira. When talking, she would just sit back and stare for a long time and just give you these long pauses and just stare at you. And a lot of people, whether powerful people or just ordinary citizens, found that very off-putting. You work with behavioral sciences. I mean, I'm sure you've seen a lot of people just giving you a blank stare for a long time. And does it make you uncomfortable?
Well, usually they're catatonic, so I understand.
Oh, okay.
But for sure, that's a tactic to wait out somebody and see who they really are when they're scrambling, when they're uncomfortable. That definitely is an interesting quality that I don't think we see anywhere else in our book.
Yeah, sometimes you have people who are just the types who you'd want to have a beer with. Indira was not one of them,
No.
And she didn't drink anyway. She once told a BBC interviewer, "I don't waste time in flowery small talk as people do in India, where the first half hour is spent in compliments. When I say, hurry up, let's get to the point, they feel hurt." And we'll see some famous people who felt hurt.
Absolutely. And I think about, I work in a hospital. I would not necessarily want the nurse who's lots of small talk, extra fun nurse. I would want someone who's to the point and calculating and here to get stuff done.
Yeah,
So
and she definitely did not have much of a bedside manner, but Indira was in some ways the doctor that India needed, not the doctor that India really wanted to have. She also had a sense of political and personal style. When her hair went white, she had it dyed black, but her Parisian hairdresser said, how about if I leave this like streak of white up the middle? And that became one of her trademarks.
Yeah, it was iconic, the skunk stripe down the middle. I mean, there's plenty of big women who rock that now, but she was making a statement. She knew she had to be a character to the people, one that they could rally behind.
Absolutely. Well, Indira wasn't really very religious. India is a country that has been defined in many ways by its many religions for hundreds, almost thousands of years. But Indira was a secular humanist. She didn't go to the temples to pray. She felt that her religion, if this is the right word for it, is making the world a better place.
And we see throughout our book a lot of queens who take on different religions. Jinga, for example, to use as a tool. Tamar of Georgia was known for her piety. And I think it's interesting she chooses to forego that tool because with a modern audience, you're bringing together all these different cultures, all these different backgrounds. And she knew that would alienate people if she was really strongly one religion.
Indira was also ambitious. She had this small cabinet group, her inner circle, that was nicknamed the Kashmiri Mafia, that was very loyal to her. She was hardworking. She stayed fit. She kept her weight off through strict diet. She didn't drink alcohol. And every morning at 5 a.m., she would get up to practice yoga for about 20 or 30 minutes.
It's like your Pilates before work.
Yeah, exactly. She was also very tough. She would give speeches, and we think of hecklers as a bad problem here. We have nothing to the Indian democracy. That's rough. She would give these speeches out, and sometimes people would throw bottles or rocks or bricks at her. Somebody threw a knife at her one time. And one time she was giving this speech, and a guy threw a rock at her, and it hit her right in the nose, broke her nose, blood spewing out of her nose. But she wouldn't back down, and so she took a fold of her sari, the traditional, Indian robe, and held it over her nose and mouth so people couldn't see the blood coming out while she finished her speech.
That speaks to her fortitude so much. Like I said, I work in behavioral health. People occasionally will throw things at me, and I try to look strong, but I pretty quickly have to go to the back room and just cry just to feel better. So the fact that she was able to continue a speech with a broken nose just to show how strong she was and how much she cared is incredible to me.
It was pretty tough. She did not take things like death threats too seriously. I mean, she had bodyguards, of course, but she didn't take it personally. She just thought that's part of the game you play in a rough area of the world, which is a democracy. Well, in 1966, the current prime minister died, and the Congress Party, which pretty much ran the country, elected Indira as her prime minister. And of course, she lives happily ever after that.
The end. Thank you for joining us.
That's scene.
We've traced the rise of a woman to the top of the world's largest democracy. When we come back, we'll watch Indira Gandhi step up when storm clouds turn to war clouds.
We're back talking about Indira Gandhi. In December 1970, a massive cyclone tore through East Pakistan. Roughly 500,000 people were killed in the storm surge and the flooding. West Pakistan, which had never treated East Pakistan particularly nicely, gave a very poor response. They just didn't do a whole lot. In fact, it was such a mess over there that the Beatles' George Harrison wrote a song and started performing benefit concerts for the Bangladeshis in East Pakistan. It was a mess, and the people of East Pakistan were getting tired of being mistreated and neglected by their government in Islamabad, in Pakistan, so they began demanding independence. Pakistan at the time was led by a military dictator named General Agha Muhammad Yahya Khan. And so to crack down on the dissidents, in March 1971, he sent the army into East Pakistan in what was called Operation Searchlight. Searchlight was basically a massive bloody repression. He sent the army in, which murdered and raped its way across East Pakistan. It was a really terrible time.
Oh, it was horrible. And they even ended up going to a women's college dorm and setting fire to it and murdering rampantly.
Yeah, they machine gunned women as they came out of the burning dorm. It was that kind of thing. They were hacking off children's arms after they killed them. They probably killed around 300,000 East Pakistanis, and the numbers could be much higher than that, depending on the source you believe. Well, the East Pakistanis began fleeing this violence, this juggernaut that was coming at them from the West Pakistani army. And where did they go?
They go to India, causing a refugee crisis.
Absolutely. Up to roughly 150,000 people per day came across the border into eastern India. This forced the Indian government to take over schools and hospitals to accommodate the refugees. They had to set up 335 different temporary refugee camps.
And India had trouble feeding its people on a good day.
Yeah, so this creates a food problem, an economic problem, and these refugees were bringing with them cholera and panic and political unrest into Bengal. So this was intolerable for India. By May, there were about 3.5 million East Pakistani refugees who were sitting on Indian territory, creating a crisis.
So what does Indira do to deal with this crisis?
Well, she knows it's got to stop, and she doesn't think that West Pakistan is going to stop anytime soon. In April 1971, she called a meeting of her cabinet, and she called in her top general. She told her general, I need you to stop this refugee problem, and if it means going to war against Pakistan, I don't mind if it is war.
She never shied away from it.
She didn't, but somebody else did. Her top general was a guy named Sam Manekshaw. He was this legend in the Indian Army. He was tall, he had this huge nose, he had a handlebar mustache, he loved his Scotch whiskey, and he loved his cassette mixtape music. He was incredibly tough. During the Second World War, when he was fighting Japan, a Japanese machine gun put 9 bullets into him. They dragged Sam off to the field hospital. The doctors were about to give up on him for dead. He was only half conscious. And one of the doctors just asked him, what happened to you? And half conscious, Sam mumbled, I got kicked by a donkey. Well,
so she has a badass at the helm of her army.
She does. And a lot of times women don't need to be the badasses at the top of the army. They need somebody else to do that work for them, professionals. And that's what happened to Manekshaw. But that comes with a price as well. It means you can't always get what you want, as the Rolling Stones said. And so when Indira told Manekshaw, General Manekshaw, that she needed the army to go launch a war in April 1971, Sam said, have you read the Bible? Well, the cabinet looked at him and said, what's that got to do with it? And General Manekshaw said, well, in the Bible, God says, let there be light, and there is light. And you're telling me, let there be war, and we're just going to have war? Are you ready for that war? Because I'm not ready for it. And Indira got really mad at this, and the other ministers got mad. And so General Manekshaw turned to the agricultural minister and said, if we go to war, I'm going to have to requisition every train and every truck on your railways and roads, and you're not going to have any way to get the crops to the people. So if there's a famine in this country, you're the one who's going to get the blame for it. I won't be there for it. My armored division is on the wrong side of the country, facing West Pakistan. And if we go to war in the summertime, the monsoon season is going to hit Bangladesh. When that happens, all the roads will be muddy except for the very few roads I can get my trucks and tanks across, and the Pakistanis are going to pick me off. This is a terrible time to do this. On top of that, during the summertime, the Himalaya mountain passes are going to be cleared from snow, and if China wants to invade us from the north, they might be able to do that. So I can promise you, if you order me to go in, I'll do it, but I can give you a 100% chance that we lose.
So we're in Indira's chambers preparing for war. She said, it is time to go to war. We must have this. We have to solve this refugee crisis. Her best general is telling her, no, this is a terrible idea. We absolutely can. And he has kind of just crossed her by openly defying her in front of her other generals. What does she do?
Well, and Sam Manekshaw tells her, we can't go launch this invasion in April 1971. It's just going to be horrible for a whole host of reasons. But we could do it in the winter. If we go in November or December, we would have a much better chance of winning. Well, Indira once said, if I'm mad, I show it. I don't cover it up. And she was mad. She ordered everybody out of the room except for General Manekshaw. And after everyone was gone, he stood in front of her and said, how would you like me to tender my resignation to you, on mental health grounds or physical grounds? With nobody else around, Indira just said, hey, relax, Sam. All that stuff you were telling me in front of the cabinet, is that true? And he said, absolutely, it's true. You're paying me to win. And I can tell you we'll lose if we invade now, but if you can wait until December, I think we can win it. And she said, okay. This is an intolerable political situation, but I'll keep the political wolves at bay and give you some time to get ready.
Sometimes you have to be patient and a good listener to be a great leader. It's not always about the war queen who says, well, I was right, and charges into the battle. She had to be patient here, but at the same time, this issue still had to be addressed. How did the rest of the world feel about her wanting to go to war?
Well, Indira knew that anytime you invade someone, you're going to get a lot of uproar from the international community. I mean, that happens today with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But in the summer of 1971, she tried to do damage control before it even happened. She went to Moscow and got a pledge that if she went to war against Pakistan, she would have military aid, they would give her political support. Then she went to the Western countries, which she knew would not support her. She went to the capitals in Europe, Bonn in Germany, London, Paris, and asked for their help in getting Pakistan to call off its troops from East Pakistan so that the refugees could go back home. She got a lot of sympathy, a lot of we're with you, a lot of thoughts and prayers, but not a lot of concrete help. And she knew she wouldn't. Then she went over to the United States, met with Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and that turned into a disaster. Mm-hmm. Remember her habit of just stopping and staring at people while they talk? Mm-hmm. That makes even secure people a little nervous after a while.
And Nixon was a little bit more than insecure.
He was insecure. He was thin-skinned, and he did not like that approach. He thought that she was, he said some pretty salty things about her on his secret tapes. And he refused to give her anything. The next day he met with her and he kept her waiting 45 minutes to send a message that she couldn't treat the President of the United States that way. But it didn't matter to Indira. All she wanted to do was be able to tell the international community, I asked for your help and you refused, so I had to solve things on my own.
Indira was on her own. If someone was going to solve the Bengali crisis, it would have to be her. After the break, we'll see what Indira did to rescue the people of Bangladesh.
The decision was made to attack on December 6, 1971, but 3 days before the invasion, General Yahya of Pakistan decided to launch his own preemptive strike. He attacked 15 Indian Air Force bases with his Pakistani Air Force. Now, it was like a bungled Pearl Harbor. It didn't really do a whole lot of damage. The Pakistani planes didn't hit much, but that didn't matter. This was a political gift to Indira, and she knew it, because she could always say, we're not the aggressor, they struck first.
It's not a war crime if they do it first.
Exactly. That was her rationale. And of course, the international community is going to accept that a little bit better. During the invasion, Indira's job was not to be any kind of strategist. She was the cheerleader, she was the team manager, and she would support her men. For instance, one time she walked into the Army's operations room for a briefing, and she looked over in the corner and saw this bottle of whiskey with a couple of highball glasses sitting next to a chair. Well, Indira didn't drink. She didn't think it was a good thing. And she looked over at General Manekshaw, and then she looked back to the bottle of whiskey and looked back at him and kind of gave him the stink eye about that. And he looked to her and said, Madam, The brand of whiskey you're looking at is called Black Dog, and that's the brand that General Yahya drinks. And I'm convinced that I can outdrink him and I can outfight him. So you'll have to forgive me if I do both. You know, it was like that story about Lincoln, who was told that General Grant was a drunk, and he said, I'd like to buy a case of his whiskey for all my other generals.
Yeah, results are results.
Exactly. Very result-oriented. Indira's goal was to liberate the Bangladeshi capital, which was Dhaka, before the superpowers could do anything to stop them. Now, Richard Nixon sent an aircraft carrier group, the USS Enterprise, a nuclear aircraft carrier, into the Indian Ocean as a warning to Indira. And then the Soviet Union's Leonid Brezhnev sent a Soviet naval squadron back there in response. And for a time, people thought, you know, this could go bad.
This could be another world war. And what's kind of interesting is, let's look at another moment in history where a woman is in charge of the decisions that are affecting most of the world at this point.
Absolutely. And in modern times, you cannot run a war mostly. You know, Russia's an exception. But you can generally not run a war for very long before the United Nations and the international community will try to shut you down. So Indira told General Manekshaw to move as fast as he could. Her political objective was the capture of Dhaka and the surrender of the East Pakistan military. And by December the 16th, this is what,
3 weeks?
Yeah, less than 3 weeks after the invasion, the Pakistani forces surrendered.
It's pretty anticlimactic, but it's a win.
Yeah, it's a win, and it's a fast win before we could get into World War III. Well, you know, this kind of thing puts a lot of stress on any leader. Like FDR, you look at pictures of him in 1940 and 1944, and he looks like a different person. Wartime does that to leaders. Indira didn't get that too much. She didn't really get ground down by war. And a BBC interviewer one time asked her, what is it about your Hindu philosophy that lets you kind of glide through these crises? It seems like Hinduism is a very acquiescent or very accepting philosophy. And Indira told the interviewer that her philosophy just faces reality. She said, it's something that gives you an inner strength. I don't get uptight, as the Americans would say. In a situation of war, you must face the situation as it comes. You give it your all. You do your best. That's all you can do. You can't do better than that, and then you shouldn't be bothered about the rest.
That resonates with me a lot. I think lately a mantra I've adopted in coming into the workforce and coming out of college is I think about what am I expected to do, which is my best. She did her best. She threw everything she had at it, and she can't live the rest of her life regretting what did and didn't happen. And I think that's kind of an incredible thing. She doesn't let the war and her leadership affect her happiness and affect really her successes in life.
That's right. A lot of people talk about war and international relations like playing a game of chess. But in a game of chess, you see the complete board. You know where all the pieces are, and you know what those pieces can do. Indira saw war more like playing a game of Texas Hold'em. You know what some of the cards are, and you see them, and then there's some that are face down. And so you have to make your decision based on the best information you have at the time. You can't beat yourself up too badly about making a wrong decision based on information you didn't know. But in this case, Indira made the right decisions.
Exactly. So how does her story end?
Well, she continues to serve a little bit longer as prime minister. Under her guidance, India tests its first atomic bomb. So that's a long way from her pacifist father's roots. She has some wars in the early 1980s, little conflicts here and there with Pakistan. Some Sikh separatists took over a temple in northern India. She considered them terrorists and launched the military in a military operation to storm the temple. A lot of people were killed. And despite the problems India's government was having with its Sikh minority, she didn't hold that against the Sikhs in her circles, and she actually had 2 bodyguards. Yeah,
and I personally love compassion, but I also love the ability to, forgive someone and not let a stereotype or a bad situation in history affect your view of a person. She didn't want to label people as villains, as terrorists like that. So trusting those Sikhs to be in her bodyguard, I think is courageous and beautiful.
It was also a bad decision.
Yes.
Two of the Sikhs, as she was getting ready to go to an interview in October 1984, two of the Sikh members of her bodyguards turned on her. One pulled a pistol out and shot her 3 times. The other one emptied a 30-round magazine from his submachine gun into her, and she died very quickly. So she ended in a very bad way, but she left a legacy. She was able to manage the reins of power in a way that moved her country forward, and that's Indira Gandhi's legacy.
So how would you rank her among our war queens? What ranking are we going to give her?
I'd give her extremely high marks. She was exceptional in diplomacy. She was exceptional in management. I think where I'd give her lower marks in would be the knowledge of military affairs. She actually wanted to go to war at a very bad time, but I give her props for being willing to change her mind. So I give her overall, I'm going to say 8.9 to 9.1.
Very nice.
So Indira gets high marks as a skilled leader. Well, that's our story of Indira Gandhi and the war against Pakistan. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of War Queens. That's our show for today. Listen to every episode of War Queens for more stories of women who brought their nations through the fires of war. If you have any questions for us about War Queens, if you're curious about something you heard on the show, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at warqueens@diversionaudio.com. Again, that's warqueens@diversionaudio.com. We'll try to answer your questions on a future episode. Find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at War Queens Podcast. War Queens is a production of Diversion Audio. Your hosts are John Jordan, Emily Jordan, and I'm Natalie Emmanuel. The show is written by John and Emily Jordan based on their book, The War Queens. Our supervising producer and sound designer is Mark Francis, with production assistance from Antonio Enriquez, editorial direction from Jacob Bronstein and Scott